All right, guys, Ronan MMA here. Welcome back to the channel. Now, in the world of mixed martial arts, there are certain things that are known, yet not really spoken about, okay? Dirty little secrets that hardcore fans are well aware of, but the more casual audience is not. There are plenty of shady people, dubious relationships, and unscrupulous business dealings. From dictators to presidents or gang members to influencers, the world of mixed martial arts can be, at times, a bit of a dark one. One of these aspects in particular, the one that we're going to focus on in this video, is grooming, okay? There are more than enough examples of this within mixed martial arts. Rose Namajunas and Pat Barry is the most famous one, the one that most people know and talk about. Then you have Aspen Ladd and her coach, Jim West. And we can throw in Movsar Evloev and his very young bride as well. Perhaps the most egregious example of this, however, is one that I rarely see spoken on. And that is the relationship between Antonina Shevchenko, the sister of Valentina Shevchenko, and their head coach, Pavel Fedetov. And considering Valentina is fighting this week, I figured it would be a good time to do this video. This particular relationship between a male coach and his much younger female pupil is quite different from the other two examples I gave of similar phenomenon. In the case of Pat Barry and Rose, there are a lot of questions regarding the timeline. Many people get the details wrong, as they are somewhat foggy. I would argue, probably to some extent, that is intentional. Rose began training at Rufus Sport at the age of 14, and in her story, she very conveniently left the gym shortly thereafter, not to return until the age of 17 years old. In my opinion, to possibly make the relationship seem not as weird or questionable. In other people's telling of this event, like Matt Mitrione, it wasn't until even more conveniently Rose's 18th birthday that she approached Pat Barry with romantic interest.
About Pat Barry and Rose, and they're trying to call Pat a predator and blah, blah, blah. I was there. I was at Duke Rufus's gym when Rose was 17 years old. I was there on her 18th birthday. I was there for the conversation that Rose had with me. It was like, hey, how do you think Pat feels about this situation? I'm turning 18 tomorrow, and I want to ask him to date. She's like, I love who he is. I love his energy. I love how excited he is. I think he's a great human being. And Rose knew from the jump, that Pat was going to be somebody that was in her life forever and ever. So for you.
Now, if you listen to Pat Barry himself, he claims they had been dating for over 5 years. And at the time of this statement, Rose was somewhere in between 20 and 21 years old, meaning the oldest she could have been, according to Pat Barry, was 16. As well as in Pat's version of events, Rose is very clearly and obviously not the one that approached him first. In the case of Aspen Ladd and Jim West, again, another seemingly intentional foggy timeline, Aspen Ladd began training mixed martial arts at the age of 15. However, allegedly, she did not begin at West Gym MMA Golds until she was 17 years old. Bit of a theme going on, okay, here? Very convenient ages and stories. Yet things like social media posts from Jim West and others contradict this, claiming that they had been working with Ladd for over 7 years when she was just 22 years old at the time of that post. Even taking the worst version of events, for both of these, at best, questionable relationships, in my opinion at least, it doesn't even begin to compare to the one between the Shevchenkos and their head coach. Both Valentina and Antonina Shevchenko began martial arts at a very young age. Valentina started at the age of 5, inspired by both her older sister as well as her mother. Her mother, Elena Shevchenko, is the president of Kyrgyzstan's National Muay Thai Association and a former multiple-time champion in that very same art. The two sisters from a very young age would take place in competitions that required travel. For me personally, this is the beginning of the very strange relationship between the two girls and their head coach. Valentina claims that both her and her sister would travel alone with their coach to take place in those competitions. There are pictures of the two of them with their coach where Valentina was around 8 years old and her sister just 11. It started off traveling months at a time and eventually would progress into years at a time to a point where they spent over 3 years together on the road, just the three of them. Eventually, it became difficult to find competition for the girls, so they decided to move to Latin America, a whole new continent. This was all between the ages of 12 to 15 for Valentina and 15 to 18 for her sister. Already, I think it's a little strange that two young girls would be permitted to travel alone with just their male coach, where they would be staying in hotel rooms together, especially for months at a time. Even weirder once those months progress into years. It leaves me with many questions, mainly where the fuck were the parents, okay? Now, perhaps their mother wanted the two girls to be able to pursue dreams that she once shared and had the opportunity to partake in herself. Maybe even some would argue it very clearly benefited them, at least for sure Valentina, becoming one of the most dominant female champions of all time. In and of itself, I guess, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, and that is the travel I'm speaking about, okay? However, learning that now Antonina Shevchenko and their head coach are married, it makes things a little more strange. This to me almost certainly implies that from a prepubescent age, Antonina Shevchenko was essentially groomed by her now husband. I know there are people who will try to defend these scenarios by saying things along the lines of, well, you don't know that for sure. Maybe they only fell in love once she turned of age, or you do know the age of consent is not the same everywhere, and maybe her parents were okay with it and things like this. These are the kind of things that people say in regards to Pat Barry and Rose Namajunas. People will attempt to rationalize all sorts of behavior, okay? The problem is, however, the reason these relationships are immoral and wrong and something you should steer clear of is because of all the questions that can arise from them. You can't really ever be for certain that it wasn't a grooming situation, even if the individual in question wasn't going into the relationship thinking to themselves, I'm going to groom this one. The situation and the environment is something that most of us have realized is probably not okay. Now, unfortunately, there is not a whole lot of information available on Pavel Fedetov aside from his rough age and the fact that he served a few years in the Red Army, okay? So he's a fucking commie to boot, all right? Other than that, this man is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Pavel was apparently born in 1969, which would make him about 56 years old today, roughly 15 years older than his spouse. A fact that by itself doesn't really mean much, but taking into consideration that he began training them as children and traveling with them alone, suddenly it means a little bit more. That means that even if we assume the travel began only when Valentina was 8 years old and never prior, that means that Pavel would have been 26 years old while Antonina Shevchenko, one of his pupils, was just 11. For me, this story is much more egregious than that of Pat Barry and Rose Namajunas, where at the very least, okay, we have a teenage girl. Obviously, it is still wrong. I am not saying otherwise, and I am not trying to defend it. But in this instance, we essentially have prepubescent children alone with a much older adult man for months at a time, and in the end, he ends up marrying one. Like I mentioned earlier, the problem with relationships like these ones are all of the unknowns. At the worst, this man was potentially a pedophile, meaning the actual medical definition of one, by the way, either grooming a child he thought was attractive at the time or would become attractive to him in just a couple of years. The best case scenario was that everything's perfectly fine and normal, nothing to see here, and we didn't even look at each other up until she became an adult, at which point they then pursued each other romantically. However, between those two scenarios, there is a lot of in between that would also be completely fucking depraved, in my opinion, okay? Now, one last aspect of this relationship I would like to bring up is Valentina. And to quote Chael Sonnen, where does she fit into all of this? I'm half joking, but apparently at one point, because there was such a heavy focus on Valentina, as she is obviously the more successful martial artist of the two sisters, almost resulted in a divorce between Pavel and Antonina. It was creating a fiction that he was so focused on Valentina Shevchenko. And if you look at social media posts and the like, it would appear more that Valentina was in fact married to her coach and not her older sister, which, by the way, that would make it, in my opinion, even fucking worse. But either way. Now, maybe they've got some sort of sister wives thing going on or something, who fucking knows. But I want to know what you guys think of this relationship and other coach-student relationships, and if you'd like me to do videos on any of these other relationships. Let me know down in the comments below. Like, subscribe, all that good shit. I will see you at the next one. Bye-bye.